London, 1815. The season's most anticipated ball was finally here. Grosvenor Square blazed with candlelight. Carriages lined the streets 3 deep. Inside, 500 of England's finest laughed, danced, and pretended not to watch each other. And Eleanor Ashworth, 18 years old, heart hammering beneath silk and lace, pretended not to watch him. She had been watching him for 2 years. Not obviously. Never obviously. Eleanor was far too careful for that. But she knew the exact moment Adrian Blackwell, the Duke of Wexford, entered a room. She knew the sound of his laugh before she saw his face. She knew he took his brandy without water, that he danced exactly 3 dances per evening, never 4, and that when he was bored, he tilted his head ever so slightly to the left. She also knew, with the quiet certainty of a girl who had learned her place early, that he had never once noticed her. The Ashworths were respectable. Comfortable. Invited to the right dinners, the right balls, seated at the right, but never the best, tables. Close enough to the flame to feel the warmth. Never close enough to burn. Eleanor had made peace with that. Or so she told herself. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," her cousin Margaret whispered beside her, pressing a glass of lemonade into her hand. "I look perfectly fine," Eleanor said. "You've been staring at the Duke of Wexford for 11 minutes. I've been staring at the chandelier. The chandelier is behind you, Ellie." Eleanor took a long sip of lemonade. Across the ballroom, Adrian was holding court the way he always did, effortlessly, infuriatingly. A circle of admirers around him like planets around the sun. He was laughing at something, head thrown back, and even from this distance Eleanor could see the way the women near him leaned in just slightly, drawn by some invisible gravity. She understood it. God help her, she understood it completely. He was not merely handsome, though he was devastatingly handsome. Dark hair, sharp jaw, that particular kind of self-possession that couldn't be bought or taught. He moved through a room like he'd built it himself. And he was kind, people said. Charming. Generous with his time and his humor. Eleanor had constructed an entire portrait of him from a safe distance. From stolen glances and second-hand stories and the way he'd once helped an elderly countess retrieve her dropped fan without a word of fuss. She knew it was foolish. She knew girls like her did not end up with men like him. She knew all of this. And still, when the crowd shifted and he turned, and for one breathless half-second his eyes swept across the room in her direction, Eleanor's heart did something completely unreasonable. Then his gaze moved on. Past her. Through her. As it always did. "Come," Margaret said gently. "Let's dance." Eleanor did not dance with Adrian that night. She danced with a kind baronet's son who stepped on her feet twice. She danced with her cousin's husband, who smelled of pipe tobacco. She laughed at the right moments, said the right things, and was, by all accounts, a perfectly pleasant guest at a perfectly splendid ball. And then, just before midnight, she slipped away from the dancing and found a quiet alcove near the east corridor to breathe. Just for a moment. Just to press her gloved hands together and remind herself that she was Eleanor Ashworth, that she was sensible and practical and not the sort of girl who fell apart over a duke who didn't know her name. She heard the voices before she saw them. 2 men, just around the corner. Close. Laughing about something. And one of those voices. She recognized it immediately. "Been after me about Lady Hargrove for 3 seasons now," Adrian was saying, dry amusement in his voice. "My mother seems to think the solution to every problem I have is a Hargrove." "She's handsome enough," the other man said. "She's handsome enough and dull enough and she'd have me redecorating Wexford within a fortnight, Sinclair, I know her type." "So who would you have, then?" If not Hargrove? A pause. The sound of a glass being set down. God, anyone. Truly, anyone. A short laugh. I'd sooner marry. Eleanor heard the shift in his voice. The slight change in tone that meant he'd spotted something, or someone, to make his point. She stepped forward, just slightly, just enough to see around the edge of the alcove. Adrian Blackwell was standing not 15 feet away. He was looking directly at her. And he was smiling. I'd sooner marry that Ashworth girl over there, he said lightly, gesturing toward her with his glass, than spend the rest of my life listening to Lady Hargrove discuss her roses. Sinclair laughed. Adrian laughed. Eleanor stood completely still. She watched Adrian's eyes flick to her face, register her expression, and for one moment, something flickered across his features. Not cruelty. Not malice. Just the brief, uncomfortable awareness that perhaps he'd miscalculated. But he said nothing. He simply turned back to Sinclair, and the conversation moved on, and Eleanor was still standing in the same spot, holding the same glass of lemonade, in the same silk dress she'd spent 3 weeks choosing for this evening. That Ashworth girl. Not her name. Not even a name. A placeholder. A throwaway. A sooner than that. Around them, the ball continued. Someone laughed too loudly nearby. The orchestra struck up a new waltz. Eleanor set her lemonade down on a side table. Very carefully. Very quietly. She walked back to her cousin. She danced one more dance. She did not cry. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of 500 people who had just heard, or would soon hear, exactly how much the Duke of Wexford thought she was worth. She cried on the carriage ride home. Silently. Turned toward the window so her mother wouldn't see. And she made herself a quiet, private promise. Not revenge. She wasn't the vengeful sort. Not hatred. She didn't have the energy for hatred. Just this. She would never be that girl again. The one in the alcove. The one holding the lemonade. The one waiting to be noticed by someone who would never, ever look. Never again. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the carriage window. London moved past her in the dark. And Eleanor Ashworth, for the very last time, wept over Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Wexford. For years later, she would own his house. For years. In the grand scheme of London's social calendar, 4 years was nothing. Families rose and fell in a single season. Fortunes were made and lost between one ball and the next. 4 years was barely enough time to change the wallpaper at Wexford Manor. And yet, 4 years was enough to turn a girl into a woman. 4 years was enough to turn a duke into a cautionary tale. Eleanor. Bath, as it turned out, suited Eleanor perfectly. Not because it was exciting, Bath was many things, but exciting was not among them. The waters were tepid, the gossip was stale, and the social calendar revolved around the same 40 families rotating through the same assembly rooms with the practiced determination of people who had nowhere better to be. But that was precisely the point. No one in Bath knew about the Wexford ball. No one had seen her face in that alcove. No one tilted their head when she entered a room, searching for the flicker of humiliation they expected to find there. In Bath, Eleanor Ashworth was simply new. She arrived in the autumn of 1815, still quiet, still careful, still the sort of girl who observed before she spoke. But something had shifted in her spine. Imperceptibly, perhaps. Invisible to anyone who hadn't known her before. She had stopped waiting. It was at a small dinner, nothing remarkable, 12 guests, unremarkable food, that she first met Sir James Caldwell. He was 53 years old. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of unhurried confidence that came not from birth but from decades of building something real with his hands and his mind. A baronet by title. A merchant by vocation. Enormously, quietly wealthy in the way that old money never quite managed, because old money inherited, and James Caldwell had earned. He sat across from Eleanor at dinner and spent the first 20 minutes asking her opinion on the wool trade. Not her opinion on the weather. Not her opinion on the latest novel. The wool trade. Eleanor, who had spent 2 years reading everything her father's library contained because there was little else to do in respectable semi-prosperity, had opinions on the wool trade. James Caldwell listened to every word. By the end of the evening, he had asked if he might call on her. Eleanor said yes, not from love, not from longing, but from something quieter and more durable, genuine interest. In him. In the life he represented. In the extraordinary novelty of being spoken to as though her thoughts had weight. They were married 6 months later. It was not a romantic marriage. Eleanor knew that. James knew that. They were honest with each other from the beginning, which was perhaps why it worked as well as it did. He was not her great love. She was not his great love had died 12 years prior, a fact he mentioned once, quietly, and never again. But there was warmth between them. Respect. A kind of companionable ease that Eleanor had not expected and came to treasure deeply. He taught her everything. Not deliberately, James was not a man who sat down and taught. But he included her. In conversations about his estates, his investments, his shipping interests along the Bristol Channel. He handed her documents to read and asked what she noticed. He took her corrections without wounded pride and her suggestions with genuine consideration. "You have a better head for this than half my managers," he told her once, not as a compliment exactly, but as a simple statement of fact. Eleanor filed that away. Next to all the other things she was learning about herself. James died in the spring of 1818. It was his heart, sudden, peaceful, in his sleep. The doctor said he likely felt nothing. Eleanor sat by his bed for a long time after, holding his hand, which was already cooling. She had not loved him the way poets wrote about. But she had loved him. She was certain of that. The quiet, steady kind of love that doesn't announce itself until it's gone and the house is suddenly very large and very silent. She grieved properly. She wore black for the appropriate period. She managed the estate with the calm efficiency James had always trusted her to bring. And then, when the mourning was done and the lawyers had finished and the full, staggering extent of Sir James Caldwell's estate had been settled entirely into Eleanor's hands. She looked at London on the map. And she thought, "I think it's time to go back." Adrian. The trouble with being universally charming was that no one ever told you the truth. Adrian Blackwell had understood this, abstractly, for years. But understanding a thing and feeling it are entirely different problems, and Adrian, brilliant in many ways, catastrophically undisciplined in the rest, had always been far better at the former. The years after the Grosvenor Square ball were, objectively, wonderful. He traveled to Paris and lost £8,000 at cards with men whose names he never learned. He bought a racehorse on impulse that turned out to be extraordinary, won a small fortune on it, and then lost that fortune plus interest on 3 subsequent horses that were considerably less extraordinary. He hosted legendary parties at Wexford Manor that people talked about for seasons afterward, drank wine that cost more than most families earned in a year, and moved through London society like a man who had never once considered that the music might stop. His mother wrote him letters. He read them with great affection and did nothing she suggested. His solicitor wrote him letters with rather more urgency. He read those too, eventually. and restructured things, and borrowed against future income, and restructured again. And for a while, for quite a long while, it worked, the way that certain structural problems work, invisibly, until they don't. The first real crack appeared in 1817. A shipping investment that Sinclair had sworn was foolproof turned out to have several fools involved, none of them proof against bad weather, worse navigation, and a cargo that arrived spoiled and unsellable. Adrian lost £40,000. He absorbed it, barely. The second crack appeared 6 months later when the mortgage on Wexford's northern estate came due and the income he'd expected from the harvest didn't materialize. He sold the northern estate. It stung. He recovered. He gave a magnificent party to prove he had recovered. The party cost £4,000. By 1819, Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Wexford, was something that dukes were simply not supposed to be. He was nearly broke. He handled it the way he handled everything, with surface composure and private terror. He stopped traveling. He declined invitations that required new clothing. He let 3 of the household staff go, quietly, generously, with references, and told himself it was a temporary measure. He sat in the study of Wexford Manor one February evening, going through figures he already knew by heart because going through them again felt like doing something, and he looked around at the room, the walls his great-grandfather had paneled, the desk that had belonged to his father, the portrait of some stern ancestral Blackwell staring down from above the fireplace, and he felt, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely frightened. Not of poverty. Not exactly. Of smallness. Of becoming small. He had been so large for so long, in rooms, in conversations, in the easy assumption that the world arranged itself around people like him, that the prospect of contraction was almost physically painful. Like a held breath that had gone on too long. His solicitor arrived the following morning with papers. The mortgage on Wexford Manor was due. There was no income to meet it. There were options, the solicitor said carefully. There were always options. Selling off portions of the grounds. Approaching certain lenders. Perhaps. Perhaps what? Adrian asked. Perhaps considering a marriage, the solicitor said, with the practiced neutrality of a man who had delivered this particular suggestion before. There are several families who would consider the Wexford title a considerable asset, regardless of the current. Get out, Adrian said. Not unkindly. But very clearly. The solicitor got out. Adrian sat alone for a long time. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He thought, really thought, about the choices that had brought him here. Not quickly, not defensively, but with the slow and uncomfortable thoroughness of a man who has finally run out of distractions. It took most of the night. By morning, he had no solutions. But he had, for the first time, a clear picture of himself. And it was not, he admitted privately, a flattering portrait. He thought, briefly, inexplicably, of a girl in an alcove. A glass of lemonade. A silk dress. A face that had gone very still. He pushed the thought away. There were more pressing matters. 3 months later, Wexford Manor went to auction. Adrian stood in the street outside and watched strangers walk through his front door with clipboards and measuring tapes and the particular expressions of people calculating value. He had 1 week to vacate. He had nowhere to go. And somewhere across London, a widow in mourning grey was stepping out of a solicitor's office with a freshly signed deed in her hand. And the faintest suggestion of something that was not quite a smile. The deed was heavier than Eleanor expected. Not physically, it was paper, ink, a solicitor's seal pressed into wax. But she sat with it in her lap in the carriage on the way back to her rented townhouse, and she turned it over in her gloved hands, and she felt the weight of it in a way that had nothing to do with paper. Wexford Manor. All properties, grounds, and structures therein. Transferred in full to Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, née Ashworth. She had not planned this. That was the thing people would later assume, that she had spent 4 years sharpening herself into a weapon, that every decision had been calculated toward this single point, that she had moved through Bath and mourning and inheritance with Wexford Manor as her fixed and secret destination. It wasn't true. She had seen the auction listing by accident. A page in a property circular that her estate manager had left on her desk. She had been looking for investment opportunities. James had always said London property was sound, and she had turned the page, and there it was. Wexford Manor. Grosvenor Square adjacent. To be auctioned the 14th of March. She had stared at it for a very long time. Then she had poured herself a cup of tea, which she did not drink, and sat in the quiet of her study, and asked herself very honestly what she was feeling. Not triumph. Not yet. Something more complicated. Something that sat between old hurt and new power, and a question she hadn't finished asking herself. She had slept on it. And then slept on it again. And on the third morning she had called for her solicitor and told him to make inquiries, discreetly, please. She did not want her name attached to the bid until it was final, and by the end of that week, Wexford Manor belonged to Eleanor Caldwell. She still wasn't entirely sure what she intended to do with that fact. The letter she sent Adrian was brief. Not cruel. Not triumphant. Just, precise. Dear Duke of Wexford. You will have been informed by now of the change of ownership at Wexford Manor. I write to you directly, as I understand you are still in residence and have 1 week remaining before the property must be vacated. I have a proposal, should you be willing to hear it. I will call at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning. I would appreciate it if you were present. Yours, Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell. She did not sign it née Ashworth. He would know. Thursday morning was bright and cold, the kind of March day that promised spring and delivered only the idea of it. Eleanor's carriage rolled through streets she hadn't traveled in 4 years, past the same Georgian facades and iron railings and early-rising vendors crying their wares into the thin morning air. She did not look out the window. She sat very straight, hands folded in her lap, and reviewed what she intended to say. She had prepared for several versions of this meeting. In one, Adrian was contrite. Diminished. Already broken by circumstance before she arrived. In another, he was defiant. That famous self-possession intact, the charm deployed like armor, the whole thing a performance of a man who refused to acknowledge the ground shifting beneath him. She had prepared responses to both. What she had not quite prepared for was the door. He opened it himself. That was the first thing. No butler. She'd known there wouldn't be, she'd heard the staff had gone, but still, somehow, she hadn't expected him to simply open his own front door. Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Wexford, in a coat that was slightly less than immaculate, hair not quite as precisely arranged as she remembered, looking at her from the threshold of the house that was no longer his. He was still devastatingly handsome. She noted this the way one notes the weather. Relevant information. Not actionable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor had spent 4 years imagining this meeting in a dozen different shapes. She had imagined herself cold, or imperious, or blistering with a composure so perfect it was its own kind of revenge. She had imagined him smaller than memory. He wasn't smaller. But something behind his eyes was different. She had expected defensiveness. What she saw instead was something rawer than that. Something that looked almost like shame. Good, she thought. And hated herself, slightly, for thinking it. Mrs. Caldwell, he said. His voice was the same. Of course it was the same. Low, clear, the particular cadence of a man accustomed to rooms going quiet when he spoke. "Please come in." "Thank you," she said. And she stepped across the threshold of Wexford Manor. He led her to the drawing room. It was still beautiful, the house, though she could see the places where things had been quietly removed. A painting gone from the east wall, the ghost of its frame still visible in the lighter patch of wallpaper. Side tables bare where ornaments had been. The fire smaller than it should have been for the size of the room. He did not offer her tea. She suspected there was no one left to make it. She did not mention this. They sat across from each other, she in the chair by the window, he on the settee opposite, and Eleanor thought distantly that 4 years ago she would have found this arrangement unimaginable. Eleanor Ashworth, sitting across from the Duke of Wexford, in his drawing room, holding the deed to his house in her bag. Life, she had come to understand, had a very particular sense of humor. "You bought it," he said. Not a question. "I did." "Why?" Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Because I could," she thought. "Because it was available. Because I saw your name on an auction listing and something in me that I thought was long dead turned over in its sleep." "It's an excellent property," she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite. "It is," he agreed. "It's been in my family for 112 years, Eleanor said. "Built by your great-grandfather, extended by your grandfather, the east wing added by your father in 1789. The grounds cover 40 acres and include a working stable yard, a kitchen garden, and a small lake that is, according to the property survey, substantially larger than it appears from the house." A pause. "You did your research," Adrian said carefully. "I always do." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way she suspected he hadn't bothered to do 4 years ago when she was simply that Ashworth girl, and Eleanor let him look. She was not the girl in the alcove anymore. She had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and she was perfectly comfortable being seen. "You said you had a proposal," he said. "I did." Eleanor smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt. "I'll be direct, if you don't mind." "Please." "I'm told you have no immediate alternative accommodation arranged." His jaw tightened slightly. "That's..." "I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm telling you that I already know it, and that I don't raise the point to embarrass you." She paused. "Primarily." Something flickered in his eyes. She continued before he could speak. "Wexford Manor is a large property. It requires maintenance. Staff. Someone on the grounds who knows the house and its workings." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm prepared to offer you accommodation here. Temporarily. In exchange for work." The word landed between them like a stone into still water. Work. She watched him absorb it. The small war she could see behind his expression, pride, pragmatism, disbelief, and something else she couldn't name yet. "What kind of work?" he said. "Flat. Careful. The stable yard primarily. It's been understaffed. The horses need proper attention and I intend to keep them." A brief pause. "There will be other tasks as they arise." "You want me," Adrian said slowly, "to work in my own stables." "My stables," Eleanor said. Gently. "Precisely. Now." The silence stretched. Outside, a carriage rattled past on the street. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Eleanor waited. She was very good at waiting. She had learned it in alcoves and carriages and solicitors' offices and the long quiet months of Bath, and she could outwait anyone. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. And she could see him calculating exits, alternatives, other options, any option that preserved the shape of his dignity. Finding none. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "Then you vacate by Sunday, as the deed requires, and I wish you every success." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "I understand there are respectable boarding houses in Southwark." She picked up her bag from beside the chair. She had almost reached the door when he spoke. "Fine." She stopped. Turned. He was still sitting. Looking at the empty wall where the painting used to be, jaw set, hands loose on his knees. A man negotiating something internal that had nothing to do with her. "Fine," he said again. Quieter. "I'll stay." Eleanor nodded once. "Stables are at 6, she said. "Mornings." And she walked out of his drawing room, her drawing room, and down the front steps and into her waiting carriage, and she did not allow herself to feel anything until the door was closed and the horses had moved and Wexford Manor had disappeared from the window behind her. Then she pressed her hand flat against her sternum, where something was beating very fast. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something more unsettled than either of those. She looked down at the deed in her lap. "What are you doing, Eleanor?" She didn't have a clean answer. But she had a house. And a stable yard. And 6 o'clock came early. 6 o'clock in the morning was, in Adrian Blackwell's considerable experience, not a time that existed for people like him. It existed for bakers. For fishmongers. For the kind of relentlessly industrious people who populated the lower floors of great houses and kept the upper floors running without ever being thanked for it. It did not exist for dukes. And yet, there he was. 5:58 in the morning, standing in the stable yard of what had been, what was, in every way that mattered to him, his home, wearing clothes he hadn't worn since a hunting trip 3 years ago, watching his breath mist in the cold air, and waiting. He had told himself, lying awake at 4 in the morning, that he would be gracious about this. Measured. He would do what was required, maintain his dignity, and use the time to formulate a proper plan for extracting himself from this arrangement as quickly as possible. He was a duke. He had connections. He had charm and intelligence and a name that still opened doors even when the house behind it had been sold from under him. This was temporary. He just needed to remember that. The stable door opened and a young groom appeared, 15, perhaps 16, with a wide-eyed expression that told Adrian the boy had been informed of the situation and found it remarkable. Adrian gave him a look that discouraged further commentary. The boy handed him a pitchfork. Adrian looked at the pitchfork. He took the pitchfork. By 7:30, he had learned several things. He had learned that horses, regardless of their owners' financial circumstances, required the same maintenance they had always required. He had learned that the particular physical work of mucking out a stable engaged muscles he had not used since, actually, he wasn't certain he had ever used these specific muscles. He had learned that hay was itchier than it appeared, that the mare in the third stall had strong opinions about strangers, and that the smell of a working stable yard at dawn was not something that faded quickly from one's clothing. He had also learned that Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell rose early. She appeared at the yard gate at 8 o'clock precisely, dressed for a morning's work in something practical and dark, her hair pinned with brisk efficiency, a small ledger under her arm. She walked through the yard with the air of someone conducting an inspection, which she was, pausing at each stall, running a gloved hand along a fence rail here, exchanging a brief word with the young groom there. She reached Adrian's corner last. He was aware, acutely, of how he must look. Coat abandoned over a stall door, shirt sleeves rolled, a significant quantity of stable yard on his boots. Eleanor looked at the boots. Then at him. "Good morning," she said. "Mrs. Caldwell." The far stall needs fresh water. I'm aware. The water, at present, is not fresh. A pause. I was getting to it, Adrian said. It's been getting to it since yesterday evening, Eleanor said pleasantly. The mayor will tell you about it if you let her. She made a small note in her ledger and moved on. Adrian watched her go. Then he picked up the water bucket. It began that afternoon. Adrian had, over the course of a long and socially successful life, discovered that charm was not merely a quality, it was a skill. A deployable, refinable, highly specific skill. And like any skill, it worked better on some targets than others. He had never, in his experience, found a target it didn't work on eventually. He found Eleanor in the library after luncheon, reviewing what appeared to be a detailed inventory of the property. He stood in the doorway, coat back on, hair reasonably arranged, the particular smile deployed that had worked in Paris and Bath and every drawing room between here and Edinburgh. I thought, he said, that since we're sharing the house, it might be worth talking. Properly. As civilized people. Eleanor did not look up from her ledger. We talked this morning, she said. About horse water. Horse water is a perfectly civilized topic. Adrian leaned against the doorframe in the way he'd been told, more than once, was particularly effective. I only mean, we knew each other, once. Or knew of each other. We needn't be. I'll need the east paddock fence assessed by end of week, Eleanor said, finally looking up. Her eyes were calm. Entirely, infuriatingly calm. The property survey flagged 2 sections that may need replacing. I'd appreciate your view on it. A pause. My view, Adrian said carefully, on fencing. You know the property. I don't yet. Your knowledge is useful. She looked back down at her ledger. Shall we say Thursday? He looked at her for a moment. Thursday, he agreed. He returned to his room, which was in the servants' quarters, which he was also being civilized about, and sat on the edge of a bed that was significantly narrower than his previous arrangements, and revised his assessment. Charm, apparently, required a gap to enter through. Eleanor Caldwell had no gaps. It rained on Wednesday. Hard, relentless, the kind of March rain that made England seem like a personal affront. Adrian worked through it because there was nothing else to be done and because he suspected, correctly, it turned out, that Eleanor would check whether he had. By afternoon he was cold, wet, and in possession of a developing theory. He found her in the kitchen, she took her tea there, he'd noticed, rather than the drawing room, which said something about her though he hadn't decided what yet, and he appeared in the doorway looking, he felt, genuinely miserable rather than performatively so, which was almost more useful. I wonder, he said, if there might be some flexibility regarding the living arrangements. The room is adequate, Eleanor said, pouring her tea. It's very small. The previous occupant, I believe it was the second undermaid, was considerably smaller than I am. The ceiling is. I'll have a look at it, Eleanor said. Adrian felt a small, tentative shift. I appreciate. Tomorrow, she said. After the paddock fencing. She sipped her tea. He stood in the doorway, still wet, still cold, and revised his theory. Pity, apparently, also required a gap. The letter arrived on Thursday. Adrian had not been entirely idle. 3 days in a stable yard left considerable time for thinking, and thinking was, when properly motivated, something Adrian Blackwell did quite well. He had ridden to Harcastle, his old solicitor, with a question. The question, carefully phrased, was whether there existed any legal irregularity in the sale of Wexford Manor that might warrant examination. Harcastle's reply was prompt. The sale was conducted in full accordance with all relevant statutes. The deed is unimpeachable. I would advise strongly against any legal challenge, which would be both expensive and unsuccessful. Yours, etc., Hardcastle. Adrian read this twice. Then he wrote to Pemberton, a second solicitor. Pemberton's reply arrived Friday. The sale was entirely legal. I am sorry, Your Grace. Yours, Pemberton. Adrian folded both letters and placed them in his coat pocket and went to assess the paddock fencing, which he had to admit, in the privacy of his own mind, genuinely needed replacing. Saturday evening, he sent 3 notes. To Sinclair, I find myself temporarily in reduced circumstances and in need of a short-term loan. Nothing dramatic. 5,000 would see me clear. To Montfort, similar situation. Similar request. 3,000 if 5 is too much. To Rawlings, I know it's been a while. 2,000? I'm good for it, you know I'm good for it. He sent them with what remained of his personal stationery, good paper, the Wexford seal, the implicit weight of his name, and waited. Sinclair replied Sunday. Dreadfully sorry old man, tremendously tight at present, you know how it is, best of luck, do keep in touch. Montfort did not reply. Rawlings replied Monday, in a letter so brief and so perfectly composed in the language of enthusiastic regret that Adrian almost admired the craftsmanship. He sat with the 3 letters on the narrow bed in the small room and looked at them for a while. He had known these men for 15 years. He was surprised, which surprised him. He thought he'd been too clear-eyed about people to be surprised. But there it was, a small, cold surprise, sitting in his chest like a stone. He folded the letters. Put them away. Looked at the ceiling, which was indeed quite low. It was the horse that did it. Or rather, it was Eleanor watching the horse. Watching him with the horse. Her name was Isolde, the mare in the 3rd stall, the one with the strong opinions about strangers. She had made her opinions about Adrian clear on day 1, pressing her ears flat and shifting away whenever he came close. He hadn't pushed it. He'd learned, somewhere in a childhood spent mostly on horses before the adult world had got hold of him, that you didn't push a mare who decided not to trust you. You worked nearby. You kept your movements slow. You let the decision be hers. By the end of the first week, she was taking sugar from his hand. He hadn't noticed Eleanor at the yard gate. He'd been talking to Isolde, quietly, absently, telling her, in a low and unguarded voice, that she was being ridiculous and that he was perfectly trustworthy, though he acknowledged she had no particular reason to believe that, and that she was right to be cautious, actually, if he was being honest, which he was trying to be, recently, with some difficulty. He heard a sound. He turned. Eleanor was standing at the gate. She had her ledger. She had been there, he could tell, for some time. They looked at each other. He waited for the comment. The small precise note in the ledger. The redirect to some outstanding task. Eleanor said nothing. She simply looked at him for a moment, one unguarded, unreadable moment, and then she made a small note, and she walked back toward the house. Adrian turned back to Isolde. Don't, he told her. The mare blinked at him slowly. Whatever you're thinking, he said. Don't. It rained again that night, worse than Wednesday, a real spring storm that rattled the windows and drove the cold under every door. Adrian was in the stable, checking the stalls were secured, when he heard the yard door open and Eleanor appeared with a lamp, her hair loose under a hastily thrown shawl, checking the same thing from the other end. They worked toward each other without speaking. Checked each stall. Confirmed the bolts. The horses shifted and resettled in the lamplight. At the last stall, Isolde's, they stopped on either side of the door. The storm made the usual noise. The mare was calm. "She trusts you now," Eleanor said. Not looking at him. Looking at the horse. Slowly, Adrian said. She came around slowly. A pause. "That's generally how it works," Eleanor said. He looked at her profile in the lamplight. The rain on the roof. The particular quality of the silence between them that was different, he noticed it, registered it, didn't know what to do with it, from the silence of the past week. "Eleanor." "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She walked back through the rain to the house, lamp swinging. Adrian stayed where he was for a moment, one hand on his old stall door, listening to the storm. Then he went to bed. Lay awake for a long time. Looked at the low ceiling. Thought about a girl who had learned, apparently, to come around slowly. And thought about what it might take, what it might genuinely, honestly take, to deserve that. April arrived without fanfare. The storms passed. The ground softened. The kitchen garden, which Eleanor had decided to restore, because James had always said there was no better investment than something that fed you, began to show the first tentative green of things coming back to life after a long time underground. Eleanor noticed this with satisfaction. She noticed most things. It was, she had come to understand, both her greatest strength and her most inconvenient quality. She noticed the way the east wing caught the morning light and the way the plasterwork in the second corridor was beginning to crack. She noticed which of the remaining staff were loyal and which were simply waiting to see which way the wind blew. And she noticed, though she would have preferred not to, that Adrian Blackwell was not behaving the way she had expected him to. She had expected the charm. That had arrived on schedule, polished and practiced, and she had deflected it without particular difficulty. She had expected the legal maneuvering. Her solicitor had flagged Hardcastle's inquiry before the ink was dry on the response. She had expected the appeals to old friends, the attempts at leverage, the 100 small ways a man accustomed to getting what he wanted might try to re-establish control. All of that had arrived, and all of it had failed, and she had been braced for the next wave. What she had not been braced for was the quiet. He had gone quiet after the letters from his friends arrived. Not sullen, not visibly, but something had shifted in him, some external noise had lowered, and the man who remained was slightly less performed than the one she'd met at the door 3 weeks ago. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She made a note in her ledger and moved on. It was a Tuesday evening in the second week of April when it happened. Eleanor was working late. She often worked late. It was a habit from the Caldwell years. James had been a night person and she'd adapted, seated at the large desk in the library with 3 property surveys spread before her and a pot of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. The house was quiet. The fire had burned down to comfortable embers. Outside, rain again, softer than the storms of March, the kind of rain that didn't threaten, just persisted. She heard his footsteps in the hall. She knew his footsteps now. She knew most things about how he moved through the house, the particular rhythm of his step, heavier than she'd expected for a man who carried himself so lightly, the slight pause he always made at the foot of the stairs as if deciding something. The library door opened. He had not knocked. She looked up. He looked, she noted, like a man who had spent the day working and then spent the evening thinking and found neither activity particularly restful. His coat was off. His cravat was loosened. There was still a trace of the stable yard about him despite, she suspected, his best efforts. He stopped when he saw her. "I didn't know you were in here," he said. "This is my library," Eleanor said. "I know that." He didn't retreat. "I was going to," he gestured vaguely at the bookshelves. "Read." "You're welcome to." He moved to the shelves. She watched him scan the spines, not randomly, she noticed, but with the particular attention of someone who actually read, who was looking for something specific in the way the titles were arranged. He pulled out a volume. Looked at it. Put it back. History, he said. You reorganized the history section. It was alphabetical by title, which is practically useless. I arranged it by period. Caldwell's system. Mine. He pulled another book. This one he kept. He did not leave. He moved to the chair by the fire, the one she thought of privately as the reading chair, the one with the best light and the worn armrest that suggested it had been someone's favorite for a very long time, and he sat down and he opened the book. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her surveys. They were silent together for 20 minutes. The rain on the windows. The fire settling. The particular quality of two people in a room pretending not to be aware of each other. It was Adrian who broke it. Why do you work this late? Because the work requires it. You could delegate. I could. She didn't look up. I prefer to understand things myself before I hand them to someone else. A pause. James Caldwell taught you that? The name landed differently than she expected. Not painfully, that surprised her. Just, differently. Like a key turning in a lock that hadn't been opened in a while. Yes, she said. Among other things. What was he like? She looked up then. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, not prurient curiosity, not the strategic information gathering she might have suspected a month ago. Something more straightforward than that. Honest, she said. He was very honest. About everything. About himself, about what he wanted, about what he didn't know. A brief pause. I found it remarkable at the time. I've come to understand it's rarer than it should be. Adrian held her gaze for a moment. That's a pointed observation, he said. It's an honest one. He looked back at his book. She looked back at her surveys. 10 minutes passed. Then he said, I know about the inquiry. Eleanor's pen stopped moving. Hardcastle, he said. I know you know. Your solicitor will have told you. She set her pen down. Folded her hands. Looked at him. Yes, she said simply. I want you to know that he stopped. Something working behind his jaw. It was a reflex. I'm not proud of it. No, Eleanor agreed. I imagine not. I wasn't trying to, another stop. I was trying to find a way out. That's all. It wasn't targeted at you specifically. It was targeted at my ownership of this house, Eleanor said. Which is specifically mine. So. He absorbed that. Fair, he said. She picked her pen back up. Eleanor. Mrs. Caldwell. A pause. Mrs. Caldwell. He said it carefully, trying on the shape of it. Can I ask you something? You can ask. He was quiet for a moment. The rain. The fire. Why is it, he said slowly, that every time I try to reach some kind of, I don't know what to call it. Common ground. Every time I try, you redirect me to fencing assessments and horse water and. Because those things need doing, Eleanor said. That's not what I mean and you know it. She looked at him. He looked back. What do you want from me? He asked. Actually. Not the stables, not the fencing, what do you actually want from me by having me here? The question sat in the room. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Longer than she intended to be. I'm not sure, she said. And it was, she recognized, the most honest thing she'd said to him since he'd arrived. He blinked, as if he'd expected deflection and didn't know what to do with the absence of it. I'm not sure, she said again. I knew what I felt when I saw that listing. I knew what I did. I have been less certain, since you arrived, whether what I wanted was what I thought it was. A long silence. What did you think it was? He asked quietly. Eleanor looked at the fire. I thought it was simple, she said. She did not elaborate. He did not push. It was 3 nights later. Eleanor had received a letter that afternoon that had put her in a particular mood. She would not have called it a bad mood. She did not, as a rule, permit herself bad moods, but there was a tightness in her jaw by evening that she could not entirely attribute to the property survey. The letter was from a cousin of James's. A man she had met twice and disliked both times, who had spent the 2 years since James's death conducting a low-level campaign of doubt about Eleanor's management of the estate, hints to mutual acquaintances, questions to solicitors, the particular kind of male uncertainty about female competence that dressed itself up as concern and smelled distinctly of resentment. He had, in this letter, suggested that perhaps a trustee might be advisable. Eleanor had written a response that she was quite proud of. She had then written a second response that was rather more appropriate to send. She was reviewing the second response when Adrian appeared in the doorway of the library, again, without knocking, which was a habit she was going to address at some point, and said something about the roof in the east corridor. A tile had come loose. He'd secured it temporarily, but it would need. Can it wait until morning? Eleanor said. Technically. But if it rains? It's not going to rain tonight. You can't know that. I can look out a window, which I did, and the sky is clear. A pause. You seem. I'm fine. I wasn't going to say. Whatever you were going to say, I assure you I'm fine. Adrian leaned against the doorframe. You know, he said, you're allowed to simply be in a bad mood. You don't have to armor it. Eleanor looked up sharply. I beg your pardon. I only mean, he stopped. But he didn't retreat. You do that. When something's wrong. You get more precise. More efficient. Like if you keep moving fast enough nothing can catch you. The silence that followed was a different quality from their usual silences. You've known me for 3 weeks, Eleanor said. I know. You have no basis for. You're right. I don't. He pushed off the doorframe. I'll see to the tile in the morning. He was almost out the door when Eleanor said, against her better judgment. Someone is questioning my ability to manage the estate. A man who has never managed anything more complex than his own waistcoat collection. Adrian stopped. A solicitor? A cousin. By marriage. James's cousin. He turned back. Leaned against the doorframe again, arms crossed now, and she saw him shift from whatever he'd been doing into something else, the focused attention of a man who was actually listening. What does he want? A trustee. Someone to oversee. As if I've given any reason whatsoever. You haven't. I know I haven't. Then ignore him. It's not that simple. He's speaking to people. The kind of people who listen to men like him about women like me and find it very easy to. She stopped. I'm sorry. This isn't your concern. Tell me his name, Adrian said. Eleanor looked at him. I'm serious, he said. Tell me his name. I know everyone in London. I know everyone they know. One conversation in the right club at the right time and no one will listen to him again. I don't want favors, Eleanor said sharply. It's not a favor. Then what is it? He was quiet for a moment. It's the only thing I still have that's worth something, he said. My name. My connections. You have the house and the money and frankly the better judgment, but I still know people. A pause. Let me be useful. For once. Actually useful. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter. About the cousin and his trustee and the particular exhaustion of having to be twice as competent to be considered half as credible. She thought about a man talking quietly to a horse who had decided not to trust him, not pushing, just staying close. His name, she said slowly, is Mr. Gerald Whitmore. Adrian nodded. Leave it with me, he said. He left. Eleanor sat alone in the library for a while after. Looking at the fire. She didn't ask what he'd said or who he'd spoken to. But 3 days later, a second letter arrived from Gerald Whitmore. Brief. Cordial. Mentioning nothing further about trustees. Eleanor read it twice. Set it down. Looked out the window at the stable yard, where Adrian was working, no longer with the rigid martyrdom of the first week, but with something more settled, more present, as if he'd stopped performing the role and simply started doing it. She watched him for a moment. Then she went downstairs and made, for the first time, 2 cups of tea. She brought one to the yard gate. He looked at it. Then at her. She said nothing. He took the cup. They stood on either side of the gate in the mild April morning and drank their tea without speaking, and it was, Eleanor thought, the most companionable 3 minutes she had spent with another person in a very long time. She took his empty cup back inside without a word. Neither of them mentioned it. But that evening, when he appeared in the library doorway, she simply gestured to the chair by the fire. He sat down. He read his book. She worked on her surveys. The rain started around 9. Neither of them moved to leave. The question occurred to Eleanor on a Wednesday morning in late April, while she was reviewing the kitchen garden accounts and trying very hard not to think about it. The question was this. When does a man change because he has to, and when does he change because he wants to? It was, she knew, not a small question. It was the question, the one that sat beneath everything else, that made the difference between a lesson learned and a performance delivered. She had been watching Adrian for 5 weeks now with the careful attention she brought to everything, cataloging, assessing, waiting for the moment the mask slipped back into place. It hadn't slipped yet. Which was, she was finding, its own kind of problem. Because she had been quite comfortable being certain about him. Certainty was clean and manageable. Certainty told you where to stand and how close to let someone and when to redirect the conversation to horse water. Uncertainty was considerably less convenient. She closed the accounts ledger and went to inspect the east paddock. It started raining on a Thursday afternoon, the sudden, malicious kind, here before you'd seen it coming, and Eleanor was in the house when she heard the noise. Not a distressing noise. More of a shuffling. A whispered argument. The kind of sound that suggested more than one person trying very hard to be quiet and failing. She followed it to the stable yard. There were 4 of them. 4 children, ages she estimated between 6 and perhaps 11, crammed into the dry corner behind the old feed storage with the particular compressed posture of people trying to be invisible. 2 boys, 2 girls, all soaked, all watching her with the wide fixed eyes of prey animals waiting to see what the predator intended. The oldest, the 11-year-old, a girl with dark hair plastered flat and a fierce protective arm around the smallest, lifted her chin. "We weren't doing anything," she said. "We were just waiting for it to stop." "Where do you live?" Eleanor asked. "The village." "Hartley." "It's 3 miles." Eleanor looked at the sky. The rain showed no indication of stopping. She looked at the children, their thin clothes, their bare hands, the smallest one shivering with a determination that was almost aggressive. She opened her mouth to call for Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Adrian appeared from the far end of the yard, carrying a saddle he'd been cleaning, and stopped when he saw the children. He looked at them. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the sky. Then he set down the saddle and said, to the oldest girl, "Come on, then." The girl frowned. "Come where?" "Inside. Out of the rain." He jerked his head toward the tack room, which was warm. She kept it warm for the horses, and dry. "You'll fit. There's a stove." "We're not supposed to go inside strangers' houses," the girl said. "Sensible policy," Adrian said. "This is a tack room. Different category." The girl considered this with the gravity of someone taking the distinction seriously. "All right," she said. She herded the other three with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times before, and Adrian held the tack room door, and Eleanor stood in the rain watching this unfold with an expression she was grateful no one was looking at. She found them 20 minutes later. The children were ranged around the small iron stove, steaming gently. The youngest had fallen asleep against the second boy's shoulder with the abrupt unconsciousness of the very young. Adrian was sitting on an upturned bucket, talking to the oldest girl, talking, Eleanor realized as she paused in the doorway, about horses. Specifically, about Isolde. "Doesn't like quick movements," he was saying. "You have to let her decide. If you hold your hand out flat and wait, she'll come to you. If you go to her, she won't." "How long does it take?" the girl asked. "Depends. Few days sometimes. Longer if she's had a bad experience with someone." He paused. "Longer if you rushed it the first time and have to start over." "Have you ever rushed it?" A brief silence. "Once or twice," Adrian said. "I'm trying to be more patient." Eleanor stepped back from the doorway. Stood in the rain for a moment. Pressed her hand briefly, absently, against her sternum. Then she went to the kitchen and told Mrs. Briggs to make a large pot of soup, enough for 4 unexpected small guests and however many people else were in the house. She didn't examine why. The rain stopped at 4. Adrian walked all 4 children back to the village himself. Eleanor heard about this from the groom. She hadn't seen him go. He returned at dusk, muddy to the knee, and went directly to the stables without stopping at the house. Eleanor watched from the library window as he moved through the yard in the failing light, settling the horses for the evening with the unhurried competence that had become, over 5 weeks, simply the way he did things. She turned back to her desk. When does a man change because he has to, and when does he change because he wants to? She had no cleaner answer than she'd had in the morning. But the shape of the question, she noticed, had shifted slightly. It felt less like an accusation. The letter from Mr. Dawson arrived on a Monday. Mr. Silas Dawson was, Eleanor's local inquiries had established, a prosperous landowner of the blunt-spoken, self-made variety who had spent the last 15 years quietly pressing the boundaries of his property outward in the way of water, finding gaps in stone, patiently, persistently, and with complete confidence that no one would push back hard enough to matter. He had, according to Eleanor's survey, annexed approximately 4 acres of Wexford's eastern boundary at some point in the last decade. The letter was cordial. It acknowledged the change of ownership. It expressed, in the language of men who regard friendliness as a negotiating strategy, a hope that they might come to a mutually agreeable arrangement regarding the boundary in question. Mutually agreeable, Eleanor translated privately, meaning favorable to Dawson. She was composing her response, careful, precise, legally grounded, when Adrian appeared in the doorway. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His expression did not change much, but something in his posture shifted, the particular alertness of a man who recognized a specific kind of opponent. "Dawson," he said. "You know him?" "I know his type. I know him specifically, we've been at the same table 3 or 4 times." He folded the letter. "What do you want to do?" "I want the 4 acres returned. I want it handled without legal proceedings if possible, because legal proceedings are expensive and slow and I have better uses for both money and time." "And if he won't?" "Then I'll pursue it legally and it will simply be less convenient." She paused. Is there a way to?" "Let me talk to him," Adrian said. "I don't want it to appear that I need." "It won't." He handed the letter back. "I'll be clear that I'm acting on your behalf. Your property, your decision, your land. I'm just translating." Eleanor looked at him. "Why do you put it that way?" "Because it's accurate." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Talk to him." She did not ask to be present. She understood, without requiring it explained, that certain conversations between certain kinds of men required the absence of the woman they concerned, not because she couldn't hold her own, but because Dawson was the type who would perform for an audience and capitulate in private, and getting what she wanted mattered more than witnessing the performance. Adrian rode to Dawson's estate on Tuesday morning. He returned by early afternoon. Eleanor was in the garden, the kitchen garden, where the first proper rows of things were coming in, when she heard him come through the gate. She kept working. She heard him cross the yard, then stop somewhere behind her. "He'll restore the boundary," Adrian said. "He'll have his surveyor mark it formally by end of month. You'll have documentation." Eleanor sat back on her heels. "That quickly?" "He's not stupid. He pushed because no one pushed back. When someone pushes back clearly, a slight pause, he reassesses." "What did you say to him?" "I told him the new owner is represented by solicitors with a great deal of patience and a great deal of money, and that I personally would find it very interesting to examine the history of all his boundary adjustments over the last 15 years if this one wasn't resolved immediately." Eleanor turned to look at him. "That's actually quite good." Something crossed his face. Not the performance of modesty, not the deflection of a man who expected praise. Just a small, private satisfaction. The kind that came from doing something well for its own sake. "Thank you," he said. Quietly. She realized, a beat later, that he was thanking her for the acknowledgement. Not fishing for more of it. Just receiving it. Like something he wasn't entirely accustomed to and was trying to learn to accept without deflecting. She turned back to the garden. "Thank you," she said. "For the land." A silence. "You're welcome," he said. "For the land." She heard him walk back toward the house. She stayed in the garden for a while after, hands in the soil, looking at the rows of green things that hadn't been there a month ago. It was May by the time it happened. A soft evening, the kind that arrived in May without announcement, all still air and long light and the smell of things growing. Eleanor was in the garden after supper, doing nothing in particular, which was unusual for her. She had been doing more of it lately. Sitting in the garden in the evenings. Watching the light change. She heard the door and didn't turn. Adrian sat down on the bench at the garden's edge, the stone one, mossy at the joints, that had probably been there for 50 years. He didn't say anything. He had stopped, she'd noticed, filling silences. The light went slowly from gold to amber. "My mother wrote," he said eventually. "Oh? She's in Bath. Well. She wanted to know how I was getting on." "What did you tell her?" A pause. "I told her I was working," he said. She wrote back 4 words. About time. Love, Mother. Eleanor made a sound that was, despite everything, almost a laugh. She sounds efficient, she said. She's devastating, Adrian said. Always has been. She knew, years ago, she tried to tell me. I told her she was being dramatic. Were you? Catastrophically. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. She'll like you, I think. When if she. He stopped himself. Eleanor did not fill the silence for him. Sorry, he said. That was presumptuous. A little, Eleanor agreed. But gently. The last of the evening light moved across the garden. The first stars showed themselves, tentatively, in the east. Eleanor, he said. We're back to Eleanor? Would you prefer? No, she said. It's fine. A silence. Can I ask you something? You asked me that before. I know. You said I could ask. He turned to look at her. Do you ever regret it? Coming back. Buying this house. This whole arrangement. Eleanor looked at the garden for a long time. At the green rose. At the things that had grown from nothing in 6 weeks. No, she said. Even with. No. He looked at her profile. She was aware of it, the quality of attention he brought, which had changed, which was no longer the strategic assessment of a man looking for angles but something more straightforward and therefore more difficult to dismiss. Why not? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Because I came back as myself, she said. Not as the girl who left. And I think I needed to do that. She paused. Whatever else happens. Whatever else happens, he repeated carefully. That's a very open-ended clause. Yes, Eleanor said. It is. She stood up. Brushed the bench's moss from her skirt. She was at the garden door when he said, quietly. I think you're the most capable person I've ever met. She stopped. Not a compliment designed to open a gap. Not charm deployed for effect. Just, a statement. Sitting in the evening air without expectation. She didn't turn around. Good night, Adrian, she said. She went inside. She stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark, hand on the wall. Breathed. Capable. James had said that. Her solicitor said it. She had worked hard to earn it as the only currency that reliably spent. But from Adrian Blackwell, in a garden at dusk, with no audience and nothing to gain. It landed differently. She pushed off the wall. Went upstairs. Told herself very firmly that landing differently was not the same as meaning something. She didn't entirely believe herself. But it was late, and the garden accounts needed finishing in the morning, and she was almost certain, not the sort of woman who lost her footing over a sentence spoken in a garden. Almost certain. She put out the lamp. Lay in the dark. Listened to the house settle around her, her house, her walls, her 40 acres, and somewhere in the quiet below, the sound of Adrian Blackwell sitting in the garden for a while longer. Not going anywhere. The invitation arrived on a Friday. Eleanor read it twice, set it on the desk, and looked at it with the expression she reserved for things that were going to require energy she hadn't budgeted. Lady Georgiana Forsyth, old money, old connections, the kind of woman who had been at the center of London society for so long she had become structural, like a load-bearing wall, was hosting a small dinner the following Thursday. 12 guests. Intimate, the invitation said, which in Lady Forsyth's vocabulary meant carefully selected for maximum conversational yield. Eleanor had met her twice. Both times the woman had been acute, gracious, and watching everything. She accepted. She did not think about who else might be invited. She did not think about how London would receive her return to a social table after 4 years, a widowhood, and the purchase of a duke's ancestral home. She thought about the East Wing accounts and whether the plasterer could come Wednesday. Thursday arrived. Eleanor wore deep blue, not morning gray, not the pale colors of a woman still uncertain of her place, but a strong, decided blue that James had once said made her look like she owned the room. She had laughed at the time. She understood it better now. The dinner was at a townhouse in Mayfair, candlelit, the table set for 12 with the particular elegance that looked effortless and cost a fortune. Eleanor arrived and was greeted by Lady Forsyth with the warm precision of a woman who had never once hugged someone accidentally. "Mrs. Caldwell. How wonderful. You look extraordinarily well." "Lady Forsyth. Thank you for the invitation. I've been meaning to have you since I heard you were back." The older woman's eyes moved over Eleanor with the speed and thoroughness of a customs inspection. "And the manner, you must tell me everything. I always thought that house needed a proper hand." She was steered toward the drawing room. She accepted a glass of wine. She oriented herself the way she always did in a new room, quietly, efficiently, mapping the faces and the dynamics and the small invisible hierarchies of who was standing closest to whom. She had not been told who else would be there. She found out when she turned and saw him across the room. Lord Henry Castlemore was 51 years old, immensely rich, recently widowed, and possessed of the specific confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone he considered worth hearing it from. She knew him by reputation. Gregarious. Connected. The kind of man who appeared at every significant gathering and made himself central to it through sheer force of presence. He was looking at her. She looked back, pleasantly, with nothing in her expression that he could read as invitation, and moved toward Lady Forsyth's other guests. He found her before dinner. "Mrs. Caldwell. I've been hoping we'd be introduced. Lord Castlemore." He was charming. She could see why people liked him, the directness of his attention, the quality of being made to feel as though you were the only person in the room. She had met it before. She had, she thought, spent enough time with the original to recognize the reproduction. They talked briefly. He was witty. She was pleasant. When they went in to dinner she found herself placed, by Lady Forsyth's careful architecture, 2 seats to his left. She noted this. Said nothing. The dinner was excellent. The conversation moved in the way of good dinner parties, expansive, overlapping, the table occasionally erupting in shared laughter. Eleanor found herself enjoying it more than she'd expected. She had missed this, she realized. Not the performance of society, but the genuine pleasure of a table full of people talking about things that mattered to them. She was in the middle of a conversation with a retired general on her right about land drainage. The general had strong opinions, it turned out, as did Eleanor, when Castlemore's voice cut across the table. He had been talking to the woman across from him, a Mrs. Hartley, and the conversation had drifted, Eleanor caught it mid-current, to the topic of Wexford Manor. "Remarkable situation," Castlemore was saying, with the warm amusement of a man telling a story he'd already shaped into something entertaining. "I understand the Duke is still on the property?" A murmur of interest around the table. "Working it, I'm told," said someone Eleanor didn't know. "Extraordinary." "Well," Castlemore said, reaching for his wine, "one does wonder, doesn't one, what the arrangement actually is." His eyes moved to Eleanor with the smoothness of a prepared movement. "Mrs. Caldwell, you must forgive the indelicacy, but I imagine London has been curious. A young widow, a displaced duke, sharing a property. What does one call the nature of such a—" He let it hang. The table had gone, in the way of dinner tables encountering something sharp, briefly and collectively quiet. Eleanor set down her fork. She was aware of every face. She was aware of the question beneath the question, the implication, dressed in civility, that her living arrangement required justification. That her choices were available for public audit. That she was, in the end, a woman whose circumstances needed explaining to men like Castlemore. She took a breath. She was opening her mouth. Mrs. Caldwell is the owner of Wexford Manor. The voice came from the far end of the table. She turned. Adrian Blackwell, who she had not known was among the 12, who had not told her he'd been invited, who was sitting beside Lady Forsyth with the particular stillness of a man who has chosen his moment carefully, looked at Castlemore with an expression of mild, polite interest. "I am her contracted groundsman," he said. "The arrangement is professional. I work the property in exchange for accommodation while I resolve certain financial matters." A brief pause. "I'd imagine London is curious about a great many things. Most of them are none of London's business." He picked up his wine glass. "The drainage question is interesting, General," he said pleasantly, turning to the man on Eleanor's right. "I've been looking at the eastern fields. What's your view on clay piping?" The general, delighted to return to drainage, launched immediately into clay piping. The table breathed again. Castlemore smiled, a practiced smile, the kind that acknowledged a point scored without conceding it, and returned to his own conversation. Eleanor looked at Adrian. He did not look back at her. He was talking to the general about pipes with every appearance of genuine interest, and she could see, in the set of his shoulders, in the careful steadiness of his voice, what that had cost him. Contracted groundsman. Not "I am the Duke of Wexford and this is beneath me and I refuse to discuss it." Not deflection, not charm, not the armor of his name. He had named himself plainly. In public. At a dinner table with people who had known him for 20 years. And he had done it to protect her from a question she shouldn't have had to answer. Eleanor turned back to her plate. She ate her next course with perfect composure. She did not let herself feel any of it until they were in the carriage on the way home. They had not planned to share a carriage. It had simply happened. Lady Forsyth's footman, arranging departures, had put them together without apparently considering the possible significance, and neither of them had corrected him, and now they were sitting across from each other in the dark and the rattle of the London streets with 6 inches between them. Neither spoke for a while. The city moved past the windows. Lamplight in intervals. "You didn't tell me you'd be there," Eleanor said. "I didn't know you'd be there," Adrian said. "Lady Forsyth keeps her guest lists private. Deliberately, I think." "She does," Eleanor agreed. Silence. "You didn't have to say that," Eleanor said. "What you said. I know. Castlemore is. I know what Castlemore is. He has a long memory. So do I." Adrian looked at the window. He was going to keep going. You could see it. He had 3 more questions lined up, each one a little worse than the last. That's how he works. A pause. "I wasn't going to sit there and let him do it. I was handling it." "I know you were." He turned to look at her then. "You're capable of handling anything. I'm aware. I wasn't doing it because I thought you couldn't." "Then why?" He looked at her for a moment. "Because I wanted to," he said simply. "Because it was the right thing. Because," he stopped. Started again more carefully. "Because you've been managing things alone for a very long time and I was sitting right there and I could actually do something useful and I did it." Eleanor held his gaze. The carriage went over a rough patch of street and they shifted with it and the 6 inches between them briefly became 4 and neither of them moved away. Contracted groundsman, she said. Something crossed his face. The beginning of something. It's accurate, he said. You said it in front of people who've known you since you were 20. Yes. How did that feel? A longer pause than she expected. Fine, he said. It felt fine. He seemed almost surprised by this. I thought it would feel worse. But it just felt accurate. And accurate felt, he looked for the word. Clean. Eleanor looked at him. In the dark of the carriage, with the lamplight coming and going across his face, he looked different than he had at that first door. Not diminished, the opposite of diminished. Something had been stripped away, she thought, that she hadn't realized was covering something worth seeing. Clean, she repeated. Clean, he said. The carriage stopped. Wexford Manor. The footman opened the door and the night air came in, and the moment, whatever it had been, whatever shape it had started to take in the dark of the carriage, dispersed like smoke. Adrian got out first and offered his hand. Eleanor looked at it. She took it. He helped her down, one brief, steady moment of contact, her gloved hand in his, and then they were on the pavement and he had let go and they were simply two people standing outside a house in the May night. Thank you, she said. For dinner. I didn't invite you to dinner. No. For what you said. He looked at her for a moment. Eleanor. Something in his voice. Something she hadn't heard from him before, not charm, not the practiced cadence of a man working toward something. Just his voice, saying her name, with no architecture around it. Not tonight, she said quietly. He was still. All right, he said. She went inside. She couldn't sleep. This was unusual. Eleanor slept with the practical efficiency of someone who understood that rest was a resource, managed like any other. But she lay in the dark for an hour and the ceiling was unhelpful and the house was too quiet in the way it sometimes was when she was aware of not being alone in it. She got up. Put on her wrap. Went downstairs. The terrace off the drawing room caught the best of the night sky. She discovered this in April, coming down for water one sleepless night and finding the door ajar. She went there now, stepping out into the mild May dark, the stones cool under her feet. She heard him almost immediately. He was already there. Of course he was. He was leaning on the stone balustrade, coat on, looking at nothing in particular. He heard her and turned, and in the split second before either of them said anything, they both absorbed the fact that they'd had the same sleepless night and come to the same terrace and neither of them had told the other. I couldn't sleep, she said. Neither could I. She went to the balustrade. Stood beside him, not close, not the 4 inches of the carriage, but not far either. The garden spread below them, dark and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, an owl. I keep thinking about something, he said. Don't. Eleanor. Not yet. She looked at the garden. I'm not, I need more time. All right. I'm not saying never. A silence. All right, he said again. Differently. She looked at him sidelong. His profile in the dark. The jaw she'd catalogued from a distance at 18, different now, not older, exactly, but settled. Heavier with experience. The particular face of a man who had been somewhere difficult and come back from it changed. That night, she said. The ball. He went still. I'm not, she chose her words carefully. I'm not bringing it up to, I just want to ask you something. Ask. Did you know I could hear you? A long pause. No, he said. I didn't know you were there until, he stopped. Until I saw your face. And then? And then I knew exactly what I'd done. His voice was even. Deliberately even. And I said nothing. Because I didn't know how. Because I was 28 years old and I had never once had to repair something I'd broken and I didn't know how. You could have simply said sorry. I know that now. It would have taken 4 seconds. I know. She looked at the garden. I cried on the way home, she said. I want you to know that. Not to make you feel worse. Just because I think you should know what it actually cost. Not as a social awkwardness. As a real thing, that happened to a real person. The silence that followed was the most complete one she had ever heard from him. I know, he said. His voice had changed. I think I've known it for a long time and it was much easier to not look directly at it. Yes, Eleanor said. I imagine it was. They stood in the dark for a while. The owl again. The distant sound of the city that never went entirely quiet. I'm sorry, he said. I've said it before, I know. But I want to say it here. Like this. Without anything else around it. Eleanor did not deflect. She did not redirect him to the paddock fencing. She simply stood with it for a moment, the apology, offered plainly, in the dark, on a terrace, with nothing to gain from it. I know, she said. Not it's fine. Not it doesn't matter. Just, I know. He exhaled. And for the first time in the 7 weeks he had been in this house, Eleanor felt the exact weight of what had been sitting between them begin, not to disappear, nothing so simple, but to shift. To redistribute itself. Into something she didn't yet have a name for but recognized, in the way you recognize things that had been there all along before you looked directly at them. She pushed off the balustrade. Good night, Adrian, she said. He turned to look at her. Good night, he said. She went inside. Climbed the stairs. Lay down in the dark. And this time, eventually, she slept. Margaret Blackwell arrived on a Tuesday without warning. This was, Eleanor would later learn, entirely characteristic. She appeared at the front door at 10:30 in the morning, a woman of 35, dark-haired like her brother, with the same sharp jaw and the same quality of taking up exactly as much space as she required and not an inch less. She was dressed well but not showily, and she looked at Eleanor when the door opened with an expression of frank, unguarded curiosity that was immediately and entirely disarming. Mrs. Caldwell, she said. I'm Margaret. Adrian's sister. I hope I'm not interrupting. Eleanor looked at her. He didn't tell you I was coming, Margaret said. I know. He doesn't know. I didn't tell him. A pause. Please come in, Eleanor said. She put her in the drawing room and called for tea and went to find Adrian, who was in the paddock with the fence he had been meaning to repair for 2 weeks and had, in the way of men avoiding things, kept finding other things to do instead. He looked up when he saw her coming. Then he looked past her at the house and something moved across his face. Margaret's carriage, he said. She's in the drawing room. He wiped his hands on his coat, a gesture she recognized by now as his version of composing himself, and she watched him absorb the fact of his sister's arrival, which seemed to involve a rapid internal negotiation she wasn't entirely privy to. I'll come, he said. I thought you might, Eleanor said. The reunion between them was brief and unsentimental in the way of people who were deeply fond of each other and had no need to perform it. Margaret looked at her brother for a moment. You look better, she said. Then what? Then 6 months ago. Then the last 3 years, actually. He said nothing. You're thinner. I've been working. I know. I heard. She glanced at Eleanor, then back at Adrian, with the efficiency of a woman who had already assembled most of what she needed to know and was here primarily to confirm it. I wanted to see for myself. Margaret. Sit down, Adrian. Drink your tea. He sat down. He drank his tea. And Eleanor, watching this from her own chair, felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight, the small, private loneliness of a woman who had been managing everything alone and had forgotten, in the managing, what it felt like to simply be in a room where two people who loved each other sat without ceremony. Adrian excused himself after an hour. There were, he said, things in the paddock, and Eleanor suspected this was partly true and partly tact, which was new, and which she noted without comment. Margaret watched him go. Then she turned to Eleanor with the same frank attention she'd arrived with. He's different, she said. People change, Eleanor said carefully. Not Adrian. Not historically. Margaret set down her cup. He's been charming his entire life. Which sounds like a compliment. It isn't, entirely. Charm is how he avoided every difficult thing for 20 years. He could make anyone like him so he never had to ask whether he deserved it. Eleanor said nothing. He deserved it, mostly, Margaret continued. He's not a bad man. He was never a bad man. But he was, unfinished. Does that make sense? Like something that had all the right qualities and none of the resistance that makes them mean something. Resistance, Eleanor repeated. Difficulty. Loss. The experience of being ordinary. Of not having the room arrange itself around you. Margaret looked at her steadily. He told me about the dinner. Castlemore. He told you about that? He tells me more than he lets on. A small smile. What he said, calling himself your groundsman in front of people who'd known him for 20 years. That's not the Adrian who left for Paris 4 years ago. That man would sooner have left the table. Eleanor looked at her hands. Mrs. Caldwell, Margaret said. I didn't come here to advocate for my brother. He wouldn't thank me for it, and frankly he doesn't need it. He needs to do his own work, which it appears he's doing. She paused. I came because I wanted to meet you. Because I heard about a woman who bought his house and gave him a pitchfork and somehow produced this. She gestured vaguely in the direction Adrian had gone. And I wanted to see who you were. And? Eleanor said. Margaret smiled. You're exactly what I expected, she said. Which is the best thing I can say about anyone. It was after luncheon. Adrian had gone back to the paddock with the stated intention of finishing the fence before dark. Margaret and Eleanor were in the garden. Margaret had asked to see the kitchen garden, apparently, and Eleanor had shown her, and they had somehow been walking for 40 minutes without it feeling like 40 minutes. They had reached the bench at the garden's edge, the stone one, mossy at the joints, and sat down without discussing it. The afternoon light was June thick and golden. Can I tell you something? Margaret said. You seem like someone who tells people things regardless, Eleanor said. Margaret laughed, a real one, unpolished. The night of the Grosvenor Square ball, she said. Eleanor went still. He told me about it. Afterward. Not that night. He came home from the ball in his usual state, laughing about something, impossible to talk to. But a few days later he came to me and he told me what had happened. Margaret looked at the garden. He was, not remorseful, exactly. He didn't have the vocabulary for remorse at 28. But he was bothered. He kept saying it wasn't what he meant. That it had come out wrong. It came out very clearly, Eleanor said. Her voice was even. I know. That's what I told him. Margaret paused. But I want you to know what he told me. Not to excuse it, there's no excusing it. But because I think you deserve the whole picture. Eleanor waited. He'd noticed you, Margaret said. Before that night. He'd seen you at 2 or 3 events that season and he'd noticed you. He didn't know what to do with it. Adrian, at 28, had never once had to do anything. Women came to him. Conversations came to him. Everything arranged itself without effort, and so he had no idea how to move toward something himself. He was going to move toward the alcove, Margaret said. That night. He'd had 3 brandies and he'd made a decision. He was going to find you and talk to you. Properly. Not the half-noticed glance across a room, but actually talk to you. Eleanor said nothing. And then Sinclair started the conversation about Lady Hargrove, and Adrian was nervous, which he never was, and his mouth ran ahead of him the way it did when he was nervous, and he looked across the room to find you, and instead of finding you across the room he found you right there, 5 feet away, in the alcove. The garden was very quiet. He said your name wrong, Margaret said. He said everything wrong. And then he saw your face and he froze. Like a complete idiot. She said this with the fond exasperation of a woman who had been watching her brother be a complete idiot for 35 years. He came to me 3 days later and said, I think I ruined something before it started and I don't know if I can fix it. He said nothing, Eleanor said. He didn't apologize. He didn't come after me. He did nothing. I know. For 4 years, he did nothing. I know. Margaret looked at her. He didn't know where to start. And then time passed and starting became harder, and he told himself you'd forgotten and he hadn't thought about it, and you know how that works. The longer you don't do a thing, the larger it gets. He could have said 4 words, Eleanor said. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Miss Ashworth, I'm sorry, that came out wrong, 4 words. Yes, Margaret said simply. He could have. And he didn't. And that is its own answer about who he was then. Eleanor looked at the garden. At the green rose. At the things growing. Who he was then, she said quietly. That's why I came, Margaret said. Not to ask you to forgive 4 years ago. That's yours to decide. But to tell you that what he felt then, imperfectly, catastrophically badly expressed, wasn't nothing. It felt like nothing, Eleanor said. I know, said Margaret. I know it did. They sat in the golden afternoon for a while. The bench was warm from the sun. The garden smelled of growing things. He's been telling me about this garden, Margaret said eventually. In his letters. He's been writing more. Longer letters. A pause. He described the rose. The light in the mornings. The way the kitchen smells now that it's being properly used. Eleanor looked at her. He's been writing about the house, Margaret said. But I think he's been writing about you. She thought about it all afternoon. She thought about it while she reviewed the estate accounts, and while she spoke to Mrs. Briggs about the week's provisions, and while she sat in the library in the early evening with a book she didn't read, turning the same page 3 times. She thought about a boy of 28 who had looked across a ballroom and lost his nerve. She thought about the 4 years. The silence. The nothing. She thought about pitchforks and horse water and contracted groundsmen said plainly in Mayfair. She thought about a terrace in the dark, and without anything else around it. She thought about resistance, and what it made mean something. She was still thinking when she heard his footsteps in the hall. They stopped outside the library. The pause he always made at the threshold. Then he knocked. For the first time, he knocked. Come in, she said. He came in. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent the afternoon working and the evening building towards something and had finally stopped talking himself out of it. His coat was off. His sleeves were down. He was holding his coat in one hand with the air of someone who had forgotten they were holding it. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Margaret told you," he said. "Yes." He absorbed this without visible surprise. He set his coat over the back of the chair, not his chair, the other one, the one closer to the door, and he stood there for a moment. "I'm not," he started. "You don't have to." "No, let me." He said it quietly. Not sharply. "Just, let me." She closed her book. He crossed the room. Not to her. To the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the garden in the early dark, and she watched him and waited, and the house held its breath around them. "I have been trying," he said, "to find the right way to say this for 3 weeks." "You don't have to find the right way." "I do, actually." He turned from the window. "Because I've spent my entire life saying the wrong thing in the right voice and having it work anyway, and I don't want that. Not with you. I want to actually say the right thing." She said nothing. He looked at her. "I stood in a ballroom when I was 28 years old," he said, "and I looked across the room and I saw you and I lost every coherent thought I had. Which had never happened to me. Not once. And Sinclair was talking at me and I was trying to think of how to get across that room and all of it came out completely wrong and I saw your face and I knew immediately, what I'd done." His voice was steady. She could see what it cost him, the steadiness. "I should have crossed that room and said I'm sorry. I should have said it that night and the next day and every time I saw you after. I didn't. Because I was a coward and because I didn't know how and because I told myself you'd forget and I told myself I'd moved on and I told myself a great many things that were not true." He paused. None of them were true. The fire. The quiet house. The garden outside, dark and growing. "Eleanor." "I'm here," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not, this isn't a strategy. I don't have a plan that this is part of. I have nothing left to plan with." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite sorrow, something that lived between the two. "I just want you to know that what I said that night was the opposite of what I meant. And I want you to know that whatever I thought I saw across that ballroom, I had no idea. I had no idea what you were. What you would become. What it would mean to watch you." He stopped. "What?" she said softly. "Run everything," he said. "Manage everything. Know everything about clay piping and fence assessments and kitchen gardens and land surveys. Be, completely, entirely yourself. Without apology. Without asking anyone's permission." He looked at her. "I want you to know that watching you do that has been the most." He stopped again. "Adrian," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it's too much. I know I don't have the right to. That's not why I said your name." He went still. She stood up. She crossed the room, not quickly, not dramatically, just, she stood up and she crossed the room and she stood in front of him, close enough that she had to look up slightly, close enough that she could see the exact expression on his face which was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on another person. "What you said that night," she said. "I'd sooner marry that Ashworth girl." "Eleanor." "What did you mean?" He looked at her. "I meant," he said carefully, "that I would consider myself fortunate." A breath. That was what I was trying to say. Badly. That I would consider it, that I would count it as, that she was, he stopped. "That you were." "Say it plainly," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "That I would be lucky," he said. "To be the man you chose." The library was very quiet. The fire breathed. Eleanor looked at him. At the jaw she had catalogued at 18, at the eyes that had moved past her 100 times in her imagination before they had finally learned to stay. She thought about the alcove. The lemonade. The girl on the carriage floor, pressing her forehead to the cold glass. She thought about Bath, and James, and 4 years of becoming someone no one could dismiss. She thought about a horse learning to trust. Slowly. On her own terms. Given time to decide. She thought, I have been deciding for months. I know, she said. And she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, just for a moment, just her palm against his face, and she felt him go entirely still beneath her touch, holding himself so carefully, so absolutely without demand, that it broke something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. I'm not ready, she said. To say everything. Not yet. I know, he said. His voice was very quiet. But she looked at him. I'm not sending you away. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment. She lowered her hand. Stepped back. Sit down, she said. Read your book. He opened his eyes. Something in his face that she had no word for. He picked up his coat from the chair. He went to the chair by the fire. He sat down. He opened his book. Eleanor went back to her desk. She opened her ledger. She stared at the same column of figures for quite a long time without seeing any of them. Outside, the garden was dark and growing. Inside, the fire burned between them. And neither of them moved to leave. 3 days passed. Eleanor did not mention the library. Adrian did not mention the library. They moved through the house and the grounds with the careful, considerate rhythm they had established over 2 months, tea at the yard gate, evenings in the library, the occasional conversation in the garden that lasted longer than either of them planned. But something had changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way of stories where a confession rearranges everything overnight. More like the way a room looks different after you've moved one piece of furniture, the same room, the same light, but your eye keeps finding the new arrangement and something in you says, yes. That's where it was always supposed to go. She caught herself watching him in ways she no longer bothered to explain away. He was careful with her. Not in the manner of a man waiting for permission, more the manner of a man who had decided that patience was not a strategy but a practice. Something he was learning to be because it was right. Not because it served him. She noticed this. She noticed everything. It was a Friday in mid-June. Eleanor had been up since 6, not the stable yard 6 of Adrian's contracted hours, but her own 6, the one that belonged to the quiet house and the early light and the particular quality of a morning before the world had got hold of it. She was in the kitchen garden. Not working. Just there. She had been doing this more. James had done it, she remembered. He used to walk the kitchen garden in the mornings without any stated purpose, and she had teased him about it once, and he had said, sometimes you just need to see what's growing. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now. She heard the gate. Adrian came through from the stable yard, coat on, the morning's work done or started, she wasn't sure which, and stopped when he saw her. The same way he always stopped. That brief recalibration. Morning, he said. Morning. He came to stand beside her. Not close. Not far. They looked at the garden. The rows were full now, June full, extravagant with green, the kind of kitchen garden that had clearly been waiting for years to be properly tended and was making up for lost time with enthusiasm. The beans are doing well, he said. Better than I expected, honestly. You've been watching the beans? I've been watching everything, he said. Neutral. Not pointed. Eleanor looked at a bean plant for a moment. Adrian. Yes. I'd like to stop being careful. A pause. In what sense, he said. Carefully. Which made her almost smile. In the sense of, she looked at him. In the sense of this. She gestured between them, the space, the garden, the 2 months of circling a thing both of them could see. I'm tired of moving around the edges of it. He looked at her. Tell me what you want, he said. Exactly. I'm not going to assume. I know you're not. She turned to face him properly. That's one of the things that's changed. He absorbed this. I want, she stopped. Started again. I want to find out what this is. Without managing it from a distance. She looked at him steadily. I'm not promising anything. I'm not, it will be slow. I don't do things quickly. I know. And if you revert, I won't. You don't know that. No, he said. You're right. I don't know that with certainty. He held her gaze. But I know that I'm not the same person I was in that ballroom. And I know that whatever I am now, I am because of this. He didn't gesture, he just held her gaze, and she understood what he meant by this. The house. The stables. The pitchfork and the fence assessments and the dinner table and the terrace at midnight and all of it. I'm not going back to what I was. Not because I can't. Because I don't want to. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Eleanor reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically. Not with grand announcement. Just her hand finding his, fingers settling between fingers, in the middle of a kitchen garden on a Friday morning in June. He looked down at their hands. Then up at her. And he smiled. Not the charm. Not the performance. Not the smile she had catalogued from across ballrooms at 18, the one that worked on everyone, that was designed to work on everyone. This one was smaller. And real. And it changed his face entirely. The beans really are doing well, he said. Eleanor laughed. It came out before she could stop it, genuine, unguarded, surprised by itself, and she heard it fill the garden and she thought, when did I last do that? They are, she said. They stood in the garden holding hands like two people who had taken the long way around to a very obvious destination and had arrived, finally, without quite meaning to, on a perfectly ordinary Friday morning. The sun moved. The beans grew. The house stood behind them, solid and sun-warmed and entirely itself. Eleanor looked at it. Her house. Her walls. Her kitchen garden. She looked at Adrian, who was looking at her with that small, real smile, her whatever this was. Come inside, she said. There's tea. There's always tea, he said. Yes, she said. There is. She let go of his hand. She walked toward the house. He followed. A young woman at a dinner party, 17, bright-eyed, new to her first season, leaned toward her mother and whispered. Who is that? Her mother followed her gaze across the room. At the far end, near the windows, a couple stood in conversation with the host. The woman was perhaps 40, dark-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who occupied space without requiring it acknowledged. She was speaking, making a point about something, her hands moving with the precision of someone accustomed to being listened to, and the people around her were doing exactly that. Listening. Fully. The way people listened when they had learned, through experience, that it was worth their while. Beside her, a man, a few years older, silver beginning at his temples, with the kind of face that had been handsome at 30 and was more interesting at 50, leaned slightly toward her as she spoke. Not performing attention. Just attending. Like someone for whom this was the natural condition. As the young woman watched, the man said something quietly into the woman's ear. The woman turned to look at him. And she smiled, not the social smile, not the one turned outward for rooms, but the small private one, the kind that didn't know it was being watched, and she said something back, and the man laughed, low and genuine. "That," said the mother, "is Eleanor Blackwell. The Duchess of Wexford." The young woman stared. "She's extraordinary." "She is." "And him?" "The Duke." Her mother paused, considering. "They have a remarkable story. If you ask her about it, she'll deflect. If you ask him, he'll tell you she saved his life. She'll say that's an overstatement." A small smile. "They're both right. What the history books recorded, in the dry language of estate records and social registers. The Wexford estate, acquired by Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell in 1819, was restored to solvency within 4 years under her management. Upon her marriage to Adrian Blackwell, 5th Duke of Wexford, in the spring of 1820, the property was jointly administered, a somewhat unorthodox arrangement that proved, by all measurable accounts, extraordinarily successful. The Wexford Northern Estate, sold under distress in 1817, was repurchased in 1824. The Wexford stables became, under the Duke's personal management, among the most respected in the county. The kitchen garden won a prize. Twice. What the history books did not record. That Eleanor kept the deed. The original one, from 1819, with the solicitor's seal pressed into wax. She kept it in the bottom drawer of the library desk, her desk, which was also his desk, because they had long since stopped keeping separate rooms in the house they shared. She kept it not as a trophy. Not as a reminder of power. She kept it because it marked the moment she had come back as herself. And she never wanted to forget what that had felt like, the weight of the paper in her lap in the carriage, the not yet knowing, the decision made from something she couldn't name but trusted. Adrian knew it was there. He had never asked her to put it away. That their children, 3 of them, eventually, each more opinionated than the last, grew up in a house where their mother ran everything with quiet competence and their father deferred to her on matters of judgment, and their parents could be found, on any given evening, in the library together. Reading. Working. Arguing occasionally, thoroughly, equitably, with the particular vigor of 2 people who had both been right about enough things to take the other seriously. Their eldest daughter, at 14, asked Eleanor once. "Did you always know about father?" Eleanor considered this. "No," she said. "When did you know?" Eleanor thought about a kitchen garden in June. About beans. About a smile she had never seen before that moment and had been seeing every day since. "When he stopped trying to charm me," she said. Her daughter thought about this. "That's very specific," she said. "Love usually is," said Eleanor. And what the young woman at the dinner party saw, watching from across the room, without knowing any of it, was simply 2 people standing near a window, 20 years in. The woman making a point. The man attending. And between them, visible even from a distance, even to a 17-year-old who didn't yet have the words for it. Something that had been built slowly. Carefully. From difficult materials. By 2 people who had both, in their different ways, learned that the things worth having were the ones you had earned the right to keep. The young woman watched them for a long moment. "I hope," she said, to no one in particular, "that it looks like that." Her mother followed her gaze. "Like what?" The young woman searched for the word. Easy, she said finally. I hope it looks that easy. Her mother smiled. It doesn't start that way, she said. No? No. She looked across the room, at the Duke and Duchess of Wexford, standing near the window in the candlelight. But if you're lucky, and if you're honest, and if you're patient, it gets there. The young woman looked. The Duchess was laughing now, at something the Duke had said. The Duke was watching her laugh. Like someone who had not yet, after 20 years, taken it for granted. Yes, said the young woman softly. Exactly like that. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.